listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to augmentation designer Dani Clode and researcher Paulina Kieliba.
If we adapt to use an extra thumb, an extra arm, tentacle, wings, or a tail, how would that impact the resources we have in our brain that are devoted to controlling our normal thumbs?
Augmentation has almost no limits.
Dani and Paulina shared their insights into designing a robotic third thumb, how the human brain supports and integrates augmentation devices, and how we can begin to use advanced prosthetics to extend our abilities in new and unexpected ways. So Dani, you created a unique augmentation device, a third thumb. And I guess the obvious question is, why?
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, so I was doing my master's degree at the Royal College of Art in design products. And I just became kind of fascinated with prosthetics as objects. They seem to kind of, cross this really unique kind of boundaries between, tools and body parts and extension and addition. And I wanted to kind of really explore that relationship and kind of explore this product that is, so unique in these kind of different forms that it has and different interactions with people. And so I started designing prosthetic arms with the Alternative Limb Project. But obviously studying product design, I really wanted to understand what the relationship was like myself and really just kind of wanted to feel that feeling of kind of controlling something extra attached to my body. And looked down on my hands, just kind of thought, wow, there's nothing more human than a thumb. And also such a challenging part of a prosthetic hand design as well. It's such a unique movement. We have so much control and just kind of trying to recreate that kind of movement. And then something about, that kind of symmetrical positioning on the hand seemed to be interesting and kind of accepted because I knew I was dealing with a really strong kind of weird, factor and wanted to kind of make sure it was still slightly accepted by people trying it on. And so, we went with that spot.
So why not something weird? Why don't you look at the animal kingdom and go, hey, you know what? We don't need a thumb. How about a tentacle? I'll attach an extra tentacle to the arm or something.
I have made a tentacle since it's the Vine arm. You can see it on the Alternative Limb Project. We made a Vine arm for Kelly Knox, who's a disability rights activist model. So that's a whole different thing. But I know, augmentation has almost no limits, kind of in terms of our imagination. But I think to kind of begin, we need to, have some connection to the body and some kind of closeness to not be too other and to start to explore that kind of relationship with the body. I think I just find thumbs just totally fascinating.
well, someone else who finds thumbs totally fascinating clearly is you, Paulina, because you two came together to have a unique collaboration to really study the impact of what happens when human beings develop this thing called a third thumb. So, Paulina, I'm fascinated in your background. What interested you in taking Dani's augmentation device and really looking closely at its impact on the brain and the body?
Yeah, so I have a quite different background, as you said. I come from engineering and neuroscience, and for us in the Plasticity Lab, we've always seen augmentation as kind of this great model to explore where the boundaries of brain plasticity are. We work a lot with amputees, and we've always been asking ourselves these questions of, how much can we harness brain plasticity to help these people regain the lost functions? Then we had this crazy thought of why, don't we switch focus for a little bit and instead of talking about regaining lost functions, talk about gaining new ones, just to help us characterize where that boundary, where that limit of that brain plasticity is. And thinking about that, planning that research, we saw Dani's device online when it went viral. It was like everywhere, YouTube, every kind of social media you can imagine. And so I just dropped Dani 1 or 2 lines over an email. She responded very quickly, and that's how our journey started.
I was keen. I was ready for this research.
Finally, someone wants to play with my thumbs. So Paulina, I mean, for anybody who doesn't know, you've used this word brain plasticity. So what is brain plasticity? In what way is the brain plastic? And why is it so important for the way in which we think about integrating augmentative devices into our body schema?
That's a great question, a really big one also. So, just to keep it simple, brain plasticity is the ability of our brain to learn and adapt based on our everyday experiences. So it can be just learning a new skill, but it can also be something as extreme as adapting how your brain is organized due to using this external device, the third thumb. And it's extremely important to sort of consider that brain plasticity in terms of all sorts of augmentation devices, really. Because given that our brain can learn and adapt to use those, we need to know what that adaptation is and what it entails. As in, if we adapt to use an extra thumb, an extra arm, tentacle, wings, or a tail, how would that impact the resources we have in our brain that are devoted to controlling our normal thumbs or normal arms, or, well, we don't have normal wings or normal tails, but, normal body parts. And would that impact be bad or good for us? So these are all very big and very open-ended questions. We don't have answers to them yet, but we're trying to figure out what those could be.
So, Dani, for anybody who doesn't know, how does the third thumb actually work? It's this beautiful image when you see it online of a thumb protruding from the opposite side of the hand, but it moves. It's able to grip. It's able to be used. Yes. So, what processes make that possible?
Yeah, so starting from on the hand. So on the hand, you kind of wear a handpiece that wraps kind of around that kind of front part and back part of your kind of, other side of your palm, opposite your biological thumb. And then coming out of that is kind of this flexible 3D printed thumb. So I print it all in one piece, and that travels through onto the base of the hand as well. So you get a little bit of mechanical feedback from the thumb as well. And then from that is a kind of Bowden tubing system that attaches to the motors. The motors are worn on the wrist, so like kind of where you wear a watch. And then up on the upper arm is a battery pack. The wrist part also contains the microcontroller, which is wirelessly connected to the pressure sensors on your feet. So on your feet, underneath your big toes, you've got 2 pressure sensors, force resistor sensors, and they are wired to something that's either worn on the side of you. I wear it on the side of my shoe, or you can have it around your ankles, and those are wirelessly connected, and those are sending kind of controller signals to the motors on the wrist, and they have proportional control. So I work with these pressure sensors with servos, and so it's not kind of like a prosthetic arm that's maybe a muscle sensor kind of trigger. You trigger it and then it does a grip. This is proportional control. So so as you press down, you're seeing the thumb move and feeling the thumb move slowly. As you press down fast, it moves fast. It kind of releases. So it's very responsive to how you control it, which is what I like to do and incorporate in all my kind of augmentation and prosthetic designs.
So the third thumb is something known as a motor augmentation. Now, how is a motor augmentation different from all of the sorts of other augmentations that human beings could potentially gain?
I guess you could start from how do we even define augmentation? I mean, I think in terms of a dictionary definition, if we want to go to the dictionary, it's hard because it's really just addition, extension, more growth, kind of stuff like that. And so I guess you go for something that's quite basic, like any surgeries with implants or anything like that is technically kind of an augmentation. And then I guess the motor side for me is the kind of movement and addition. But then I guess for Paulina in the Plasticity Lab, motor means something a bit different.
No, it's pretty much the same. It has to do with movement, right? So motor augmentation is something that allows us to move differently, to perform movements that were not possible before. And different kind of augmentation would be, for example, sensory augmentation, right? And then Neil Harrison, the Iborg guy, that would be an example of that. He's adding an extra sense to his body. The third thumb is not really adding an extra sense, it's just adding an extra body part that can move in a different way. So it enhances our motor functions, our ability to move and interact with the world.
Now, Paulina, you used that word there, enhance. Do you feel like the third thumb is an enhancement? What extra abilities, I guess, does the third thumb provide? Or did you realize in your study, in actual fact, that having an additional 6th appendage on a hand can sometimes get in the way?
I mean, at the very beginning, it can probably get in the way sometimes just because you're not used to having it, right? But it's not so much right now about whether it does provide extra function. It's more about whether it provides extra possibilities. And this is, something that's really up to your creativity, how you decide to use it and how you decide to incorporate it in your daily life. It does allow you to grasp more. It does allow you to do more with one hand. For example, in one of our training tasks, we asked people to carry and flip, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wine glasses, which is impossible to do normally. Or, stir content of a coffee mug or whatever glass in the air, while holding that glass. That's, perhaps doable with one hand, but not something people do on a daily basis. So such augmentative devices, a third time, but definitely allow you more possibilities to interact with the world. But how you do that, it's really up to you. And people come up with very different use scenarios.
Well, Dani, what are some of those wild use scenarios that you've actually seen?
Yeah, so my kind of main, when designing it, it was very much about into the hand, so across the hand. And so kind of bringing the thumb, so really those really kind of subtle movements, and perhaps splitting, the hand into two, as, trying to recreate that kind of thumb, index, middle finger kind of grasp with perhaps the ring finger and the little finger and an extra digit. So just kind of really trying to split that hand up, which we just kind of saw in our, finger maps, with the study. Is finger maps the right word, Paulina?
We didn't look precisely at finger maps. But
Sorry, I'm kidding.
Finger maps is palm reading, isn't it, Paulina?
Okay. No. I have so much terminology I need to learn with these collaborations.
I guess that would also be that, but there is a term finger maps in the neuroscientific community, so that's not very far off. It's just something slightly different.
Okay. So just trying to really kind of get more function out of the hand, and also with our task, just kind of being able to grasp something with the hand and then freeing up that kind of thumb, index, middle finger, which is for us, we're so dexterous with those fingers. Practice with opening a bottle, holding tools. I think I've just managed to thread a needle, so I can hold a needle with the third thumb and thread it with my index and thumb.
That's incredibly impressive.
Yeah. But and also kind of multi-grasp. We have a multiple balls task in the study as well, which in terms of increasing the grasp of the hand. But for me personally, it's those really kind of dexterous tasks that are really interesting.
It's so interesting that when you first launched the third thumb, it really captured the imagination of individuals. It was this beautiful provocation, showing a possibility for what a future human could potentially look like when augmented by technology. And then seeing that additional appendage was such a visceral image. But the way in which these devices work is they don't just capture the imagination, they can actually fundamentally change the brain. And Paulina, I want to turn to you and ask, what did your recent study show in how people are finding this enhancement begins to change really their brain and the way in which they navigate the world?
This is actually something that we found very surprising, that we managed to capture that change in the brain, given the fact that we only ask people to wear and use that thumb for 5 days.
Wow.
But what we looked at was the representation of their natural hand in the sensory motor cortex. So the part of the brain that's normally dealing with movement and sensing the world, right? And in that part of the brain, we all have this thing called hand representation, where every single digit is represented quite distinctly, one next to the other, in a similar organization as in our actual, biological hand. And after using the third thumb for 5 days, we saw that our participants they didn't start changing the hand representation. The hand representation started changing in such a way that all these individual fingers in the movement region, right, became more alike to one another. So moving your natural thumb and moving your index finger was now more similar than it was before having an augmented hand. And that's something incredibly surprising and interesting, because the same hand representation, as I've mentioned before in our lab, we work quite a lot with amputees. And we see that people that lost their hand 20 years ago, 10 years ago, they still have that hand representation in the brain, and it's quite stable. So to see that here, only after 5 days of training, there are some changes was quite exciting.
And why was it important to you to carry out this study on able-bodied individuals? Why was it important to define the parameters there and ensure that this could be seen as a form of augmentation?
One thing, this augmentation sort of, not research, but augmentative technologies are becoming more and more popular. Like every year we hear about engineers building new devices that are supposed to add to our normal functions, enhance us, allow us to do more, to run faster, to do things better. And I think until now, there hasn't really been much talk into how does our brain react to that? And is it even able to support it? So we were, fast tracking all the technological progress, but I feel like we haven't stopped to ask, okay, is that technological progress, are we able to deal with that? Is our brain going to be able to handle it? And we wanted to have that discussion, now rather than in 10 or 20 years when all these devices are on the market and everyone is trying to use them. And they may cause some problems, they may not, we don't know. So we wanted to, get into it now and start having that discourse quite early on.
I mean, that was the stunning thing, that only after 5 days that individuals were starting to incorporate this additional appendage into their body schema. And for you, Dani, as a product designer, to suddenly realize that your device, the thing that you created, had such a massive impact on human bodies and brains. I mean, what did that feel like for you?
Oh, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was, to be honest, like this project really started as kind of just an exploration into kind of understanding this relationship, and then seeing it online and the response that I got online, and then in that way I saw it as like, this catalyst for conversation. People were discussing it, in comments and discussing it. So that's where I thought that would live. And then Paulina contacting me and having this whole new life in this research. It's just, it's constant, and I keep iterating the design as well, but also working in the lab and working with the participants as well, kind of seeing their response. But everyone's response the first time they've put it on is always, they just stare at it, just so amazed. And I'm constantly excited at the next kind of thing that happens with this project.
Well, for spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read this study, basically you spend 5 days with these individuals and you study the changes in their brain through multiple different ways, from fMRI to allowing them to fill out questionnaires, through different training in the lab. From a methodological standpoint, Paulina, why was it so important that you incorporated things like brain imaging, motion tracking, the force sensors in the hand? Why was it so integral to collect so much data on how people were using, and I guess in some ways being used by, the third thumb?
Yeah, I mean, we just wanted to have as complete picture as possible, right? There are some things that questionnaires won't pick up on, or behavioral tasks like asking people to do something and measuring reaction times or force productions, and that brain imaging can allow us to answer quite easily. And vice versa, there are things that we cannot pick up with the techniques we are using for brain imaging, but that we could potentially pick up with stuff like questionnaires or force measurements. So we just wanted to have as complete picture as possible.
Well, that's one of the things I find so fascinating about the study was this embodiment questions. You were asking them questions with regards to things like body ownership. Does the robotic finger, does it belong to you? Does it feel like it's part of your hand, part of your body? Does it feel like a foreign object? Does it feel like it's fused with your body? Does it feel like you have 6 fingers? I mean, these are highly provocative questions that you're asking individuals to really question how personally they feel this thing is integrated into their body. Was there any surprising things that came from that questionnaire?
Yeah, this is highly personal for the people that filled in these questionnaires, and it's I'm not sure if it was surprising, but it was definitely exciting to see that all these people that used the third thumb for 5 days, they actually did start feeling like it was becoming a part of their hand, like it was becoming a part of their body, like it was something normal for them to have 6 fingers. Yeah. And importantly, that's not something that we observed in the control group of people, right? So apart from these 20 people that we trained to use this third thumb, we also recruited 11 controls. So people that wore the third thumb, but just had no control over it whatsoever. It was static. It was not movable, but they still wore it for for the same duration of time. And they didn't report that. They didn't report having any increased sense of ownership, of agency of that extra device, suggesting that, just wearing something on your hand and, just having it as sort of an accessory is not enough to sort of give you that feeling of this is a part of me. So it was definitely exciting to see that. But then we also have to be, a little bit cautious, because the way we probed these things, the embodiment was through questionnaires. So it was self-reported. And, people have very different subjective opinions. With questionnaires, they also sometimes feel like, maybe they are expected to answer one way or another. We don't think that's the case. That's why we ask them to fill in these questionnaires twice to make sure. But, this is just one aspect of embodiment we really probed this way.
It was amazing actually seeing the change. And for me as a designer, and this was a collaboration, but also I worked in the lab, I worked with the participants, and I was collecting data as well some days. And to see the change over the week between this relationship, which is really the start of the project, why I was interested in the first place, was just so satisfying. And, we had one girl, she didn't want to give it back. She, had to say goodbye. She had to have a moment to say goodbye to it. It was so crazy. And I mean, I think the most I wore was during my exhibition at RCA, and I wore it for a full week, but I didn't do near the hours that they did because I was taking it on and off. And obviously I wasn't doing the training that they were doing as well, this intensive training for 2 hours. And then they also took it home. I think that's them taking it home, taking it out of the lab. They got to just do what they wanted with it. Seeing it in their own, home settings as well, really kind of helped, reinforce this connection that was developing. And it was just so fascinating to see it across the week just develop.
Yeah, we also had one girl that actually named it. I don't remember what the name was, but I remember she did give it a name. It was super sweet.
And I've seen that happen with, people with their prosthetics. It's really interesting, this relationship with this product.
For some people, did it really feel like an organ? I know Neil Harbisson, the colourblind artist, because he has, I guess, worn, but now it's more integrated into his skull. But because he's had the antenna that allows him to hear colour for so long, he doesn't see it as a device anymore. He really does see it as an extension of his body. And if you go up to him and try and touch the camera, he'll recoil in the same way as if I went up to either of you and tried to touch you on the nose. He really does see it no longer as a device, but as this organ.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, a lot of people, because obviously there's the sensory element, a lot of people ask me if I, put kind of feedback, electronic feedback into it, and I haven't. It's all mechanical, but I've designed it in a way that when you touch the thumb, if you wear the thumb long enough, like I have, for a long period of time, you can actually tell the difference even between the tip of the thumb and that middle section as well. You can actually feel the difference. Wow. And, I can feel when someone is stroking different textures with it, because there's a lot of mechanical things going on. The hand is obviously so receptive to different vibrations and different areas, and you start to learn the kind of different spots. And then also that's even before you turn it on. Then when you turn it on, you've got the vibration of the motors, and the two different motors obviously do the two different, the flexion, extension, and adduction, abduction, and then in between you can feel the motors kind of pulling and tensioning at different times. And so there's a lot going on that, and I don't at this stage want to put in any kind of fake feedback, because I think this kind of mechanical feedback is so visceral and kind of, it really reinforces that feeling that you kind of have control over this thing, and you can feel kind of the end of it.
I mean, in many ways, that shows the power of the human brain to really integrate an appendage like this into the body. And it's what Andy Clark would call profound embodiment. If we really want to create true cyborgs, the way in which to do it is sometimes less is more. It's those very subtle relationships that we have with tools and technology, but more importantly, not just a subtle relationship, but a durational relationship. act of wearing it for long periods of time is the thing that eventually allows it to become part of the body. A lot of people think that when it comes to augmentation, it's just plug and play, but really it's more plug and wait. You have to realize that there's going to be
plug and train.
Plug and train, exactly.
Plug and train, yeah.
Plug and train.
Yeah, there's going to be a process through which it can take a multiple amount of time for your brain to accept it as part of you. For Neil Harbisson, it was 10 years, and now he reportedly dreams in sonochromatic dreams, subjectively reports that, and it feels the same way with something like this. And Dani, I'm fascinated by your personal experience of using the thumb. I notice you're not wearing it now. I mean, do you consider yourself an individual who now has 11 fingers, or are you someone who wears it occasionally as maybe a fashion accessory? I mean, what is your relationship with your third thumb?
Yeah, I mean, so firstly, even though we have training, we've got a lot of new studies kind of happening in the lab with the third thumb as well. No one can use mine. My thumb is my thumb.
Does it have a name, Dani? Does it have a name yet?
No, it doesn't actually. It doesn't have a name. But yeah, so there is definitely a personal attachment, and I would feel really weird if someone else was to put it on. I have to say, I do kind of leave my work at work at the moment. So because I'm obviously working on it all day, it is quite hard for me to just kind of take it home as well. But when I put it on, I do feel like it's really hard to describe because it's been so many years. I think I started this in 2017, and I've been iterating it for all that time as well. So I'm making it stronger and more kind of dexterous and with different controls as well. So it's just it's when I put it on, it does feel like I have kind of put something back on that was missing. And I know that's a lot to say, but I do kind of feel, because I've just gotten so used to it. And I've tried, because I made a left-handed one. The main thumb is a right-handed thumb, and it's a very boring reason why. It's because I'm left-handed and I could work on it whilst I was wearing it. but I have made a left-handed thumb as well, and it didn't feel the same.
Interesting.
So it's because I haven't had that training, or like not training specifically, but just haven't had that time wearing it. This is just subjective feelings, obviously, but it's something different.
Well, as you mentioned, Dani, the thumb is controlled by the toes in many ways. It makes it very hard to use the thumb whilst walking for that reason. But yes. Paulina, if the thumb is controlled by the toes, then why didn't the toes become part of the hand? What's going on there in the human brain?
That's a very good question. When we started this study, we actually had this hypothesis that, after these 5 days, perhaps the toes will not necessarily become a part of the hand representation, but maybe there would be more connectivity, let's say functional connectivity between these regions. So, when you activate your hand region, maybe the toe region would activate as well. We did expect to find more similarity between those body parts in the brain, and we didn't. The short answer is, I don't know why. I was really betting on that one. That was the one I was really expecting to find. Yeah. And then it just didn't happen. And it's difficult to say why. I don't even have like a good guesstimation or a hypothesis. Perhaps this was just not enough in terms of time. Maybe if we trained people for 2 more months, things would look slightly differently. This was a very short-term intervention. After all, 5 days is not so much in the terms of motor learning. Perhaps our brain is actually somehow distinguishing between, moving just your toes and moving the third thumb. That's also an option. But that's something we were not able to unpack here, and something we were not able to look at because we focused on the representation of our natural body. Mm-hmm. We didn't so much study the representation of this extra digit. And this is, again, mostly for a mundane reason. Back when we started this study, the third thumb was not MRI safe. So we couldn't ask people to wear it in the scanner and move it because things could go really badly.
They'd have no hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Or a head, or, instead of augmenting, we would be creating very disabled people potentially. But this is going to be possible quite soon because Dani has now upgraded the design and she designed an MRI compatible thumb. So hopefully in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's not I would say it's a shoot off to the side. It's not an upgrade. It's a MRI safe version, because obviously it requires a lot of lengths of tubing and some very, very large motors that are not wearable anymore. I had to kind of pretty much convert the pipes that go across the wrist to from about 5 centimeters to about 7 meters, and then through a wall into the control room of the MRI control room. So,
well, apart from designing a third thumb specifically for MRI machines, did the study teach you, Dani, about how to adapt or improve potentially that design? Because originally it was done in an arts context. You wore it in a gallery setting, and suddenly these things are on multiple participants out in the wild, being used in everyday life. Did you, as a product designer, learn something from having your thumb in the hands, or I guess on the hands, of real users?
Absolutely. I mean, the first model, I mean, it really couldn't even hold anything, in particular. It was just, it was because I really was just focusing on the movement. And also I was really focused on that visual element, being art school and art and design school, and really focusing on that, creating that balance with the size of the biological thumb. And then as we kind of started chatting with Paulina, it became very apparent that I needed to make some serious upgrades, mostly to do with strength. So, at the size of the thumb, how much you could grip. It's hard because obviously with augmentation, everything's on the outside. So where we kind of have that kind of squishy part of the base of our biological thumb where some things can kind of rest, obviously the base of the thumb is a kind of rigid element on the hand. So the thumb needs to be slightly bigger than the biological thumb in order to grip kind of the same as our thumbs. So there's a lot of changes, but I mean, I have to say that almost every thumb I make, so I make everything from scratch. I 3D print everything myself, and I feel like at the moment every thumb I make is an iteration from the one before, because that's how many kind of ideas and new changes I'm having. But the thumb's going through a massive makeover at the moment, and in terms of strength. So that's been the main concern, is that obviously when you do one thing and you can achieve that thing, you want to do more. You want to go, oh, I can pick up something heavier and bigger and stuff like that. So we had kind of a couple of motor failures in terms of people kind of pushing it too hard. But hey, that's exciting for designers who are constantly wanting to upgrade.
Well, this idea of brain plasticity, it does feel like, knowing that brain plasticity does have this effect that allows us to integrate these tools and devices into our body, that becomes very exciting for the creation of cyborgs, knowing that with small amounts of vibration, with 3D printing, with careful and considered design, that we can start generating and creating a multitude of possible augmentations for the body. But is brain plasticity, is it a platform on which you can add new devices, or is brain plasticity more of a bottleneck that needs to be overcome? Would it just be easier to just bypass all of the senses and the body and just jack these things directly into the brain?
That's an excellent question. Actually, I feel like it's two separate questions. One about whether the brain plasticity is a bottleneck, and the second one about should we make it brain controlled, right? I'll start with the first one. So in terms of whether brain plasticity is our friend or our enemy here, we don't know yet. It's something we definitely cannot sort of circumvent, but we don't have definite answers, right? With our study, we see that this brain plasticity is playing a part. It's happening. Something is changing in our brain, but we don't know if that's good or bad. It could be both, right? In a good sense, it could mean that our brain can find a better, more optimal, more compact representation of the body we already have, and then, direct other resources to use these extras, whether these extras are extra senses or extra thumbs or extra whatever. But on the other hand side, similarly possible scenario is that it is a bottleneck. It has a limited number or resources that are now going all to our normal body, normal senses. And when we add something on top of that, we need to sacrifice a little bit of those resources to give to the extra. And that could potentially impact how we are able to control our natural body. Like very sort of dystopian scenario, it could make us more clumsy when operating our natural hands. We unfortunately don't know which of these scenarios is true. Like our results support both of those. We don't see any sort of evidence of any behavioral changes or disruptions to how people control their bodies. But it's definitely something that should be kept in mind, that this can go both ways. And then in terms of whether this should be brain controlled, and Dani for sure will also have some great insights on that. I mean, I think eventually this is the way everything is going right now. People are so hyped and interested in this brain-machine interfaces. Everyone is trying to make everything brain-controlled. But at the point where we are now, personally, I feel like that may be a little bit of an overkill, because if we have a viable solution to use this kind of devices that does not require getting an invasive surgery and implanting electrodes in your brain and going through the risk of all these surgical procedures, then why not use that? Especially since that whole brain control story is it's not trivial. Because in terms of most of the BMI interfaces we see out there are being used by amputees or people that lost some function. So they have these freed up resources that they can devote to the control of the robotic arm or robotic whatever. But in case of augmentation, we don't really have these freed up resources. So figuring out which part of the brain we want to perhaps sacrifice a little bit or, reroute is quite tricky.
And Dani, what made you then look at the human body and look at the brain and go, you know what? What's the opposite of that? Well, the foot. So let's go down there and use that as the control mechanism. Did you ever consider messing with EEG machines to enable the closing of the thumb?
Yeah, I didn't know any brain scientists back then.
But now you do.
No, I did. Yeah, now I do. Yeah, no, I did look at muscle sensors. Obviously it was all kind of DIY, kind of Arduino stuff that I could get my hands on. And obviously it was quite new for me. But, what I realized on the arm, I managed to get, that bicep control, moving a finger, just that 1 degree of freedom, more like a finger than a thumb. And then I just thought, well, where else am I going to get another muscle control point? And obviously EMGs are so advanced beyond what I had access to, but I just really wanted it to be something separate, something additional that was almost kind of away from the arm a little bit, and you didn't kind of see me kind of flexing to kind of move this thing, and so I just kind of I did a bit of a study of the body and put sensors on my friend and got them to move a lot, and kind of I really wanted to not impact so much. And one of the great things was about the feet and the toes in particular was people at this beginning couldn't work out how I was moving it. So when I did my half year show, they were freaking out because they thought it was brain control because I was moving it so subtly, with such a subtle movement of my body. That they couldn't work it out. And I liked that. So it was kind of separate away from the arm. Also, being a product designer, I was inspired by other products. We often use the feet to extend the task the hands are doing through specialized equipment, drums, pianos, electric guitars, sewing machines, but then more, generalized equipment like driving. You don't think about when you've got your hand in the wheel, you're looking forward, you don't think about your foot going down, it just goes down because of that kind of integration that with that system of being in that, using that kind of tool. So it kind of, it made sense. I'm not claiming it's the best way forward. Obviously, you can't run upstairs and use a third thumb at the same time, but it's when you're seated, your feet tend to not be doing too much, and it provides that kind of really dexterous, proportional control that I wanted from it.
I always remember in conversation with Connor Rossamano, who runs OpenBCI, he was looking at all of this hype around brain-controlled 3D printed prosthetics in around 2015 to 2016. And of course, he was looking at this stuff going, man, this is just spike and alpha wave. So if you want a prosthetic limb to close, just close your eyes and the thing will close. And he was at one point going to create a heart control prosthetic limb where every time your heart beat, your hand would close, just to prove a point that, even though the hype is brain controlled 3D printed prosthetic, the tech behind what signals you can get from the brain were very basic at the time. There's a lot of these gaming devices that really just did, alpha wave spike. That was really all they could capture. But there's findings of the study. They're significant for multiple reasons, but one is the future of work, because learning that we can integrate these augmentations and they won't have massive long-term detrimental effects on the brain, that's going to be massively important for how we look at the future of the workplace and how we enable individuals to use things like exoskeletons and other forms of industrial-based augmentation. So Paulina, could you tell me a little bit about the importance of this study to future ways in which we look at augmentative devices?
Yeah, so, there's so many things you could do better if you had an extra hand or an extra pair of hands. And I think that applies to everyone in everyday life scenarios, but especially to certain kind of professions.
I just spoke to a surgeon yesterday who is keen to work with the thumb. So yeah, it's definitely, happening.
Yeah, it's not made up scenarios. It's happening. People are interested.
He's very excited. And also surgeons are great kind of users because they put hundreds of hours into training on their equipment, and so would just be amazing users of augmentation, I think.
Similarly, electricians, I think Dani also had like an electrician contact you saying that he would love to have a third thumb, right? Because think about it, they're soldering a lot of things, like putting a lot of components together. They need to stabilize something, hold with, these multiple clamps right now. But what if they could instead do it with an extra appendage? Or, going a little bit bigger scale, like engineers that have to do work sometimes in dangerous circumstances. If they could have these extra appendages, here being, very sort of hypothetical, say 2 tentacle arms that are heat resistant, can get out of their body and they have full control over it, right? That would make their life and work so much easier. Or even, holding something above your head and being able to attach screws to it. There are lots of work-life scenarios that I think augmentation would really help in.
Yeah, and especially some scenarios where, it's collaborative work, you require an assistant. And so just that collaboration of those kind of movements can really streamline it if you're kind of in control of those 3 or 4 elements,
Also, I literally just had that thought, but, in terms of ergonomics, in a lot of workplaces, I don't know, in some factories, people are doing repeated movements every day. And there has been increased talk about how that affects, their spine, their back, generally their body health. And perhaps, some of this load they're right now carrying and doing with their natural body could be done with these augmentative devices without impacting actually their natural body, right? So it would be more ergonomical.
Yeah, I mean, that's merging kind of more, exoskeleton. Yeah, it depends on, how we define, augmentation.
Yeah, but surely, you could grab something with a tentacle arm and then it doesn't matter in what orientation you grab it, right? It doesn't affect your position.
Well, it's clear that these sorts of devices, they have very specific uses in very specific domains and often industry. And I think the fascinating thing about the study is the fact that the brain is able to recover after its usage. You don't want someone to be using a augmentative device and then taking the thing off at the end of the day, going home and feeling like they have something missing or that their brain doesn't feel quite rightly placed or they lose their dexterity in other ways. You need to know that the body, I guess, is this adaptive platform, because if you were to, strap up an Amazon worker with some augmentative device and it messed with them for the rest of their life, then that would be highly problematic. And if I've read your study correctly, it does look like these things won't have that immediate detrimental long-term effect.
So we need to be a little bit careful with saying that, because we just did 5 days.
Yeah, 5 days. Yeah, we did actually. Paulina and I were just discussing this yesterday, actually, just about long-term effects.
So with 5 days of using the tab and then not using it for a week, things went back to normal, which is great. And we are so happy they did, because precisely of the reasons you mentioned, right? We're not sure when they went back to normal. Yeah. Maybe it was even a shorter term change that we thought, because we didn't take an intermediate scan, right? We took one after the training and then 1 week after, and nothing in between. But the big question is, if those people were using and wearing that for 8 hours a day for 2 months or half a year or a year, would it sort of bounce back to normal equally fast, or would it at all, right? Because I guess the big worry here is that if it doesn't bounce back, you may actually, instead of augmenting people, be creating new disabilities.
If Dani, for example, who might be a willing participant in a long-term study, and after a year we ripped her thumb that by then she's probably named away from her body, then she may start getting the sort of phantom sensations that amputees get. And I think that's the most fascinating thing about these individuals who want to enhance themselves or add these additions. And you look look at someone like Neil Harbisson, who's worn the thing for 10 years, taking it away would really be like repossessing his organs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that does Neil have his actually implanted now?
It's a little bit controversial, but as far as we're aware, there is some form of implant there. It used to be a plug. I now think it's a magnet, but essentially it is integrated.
Oh, it's a magnet, so similar to a cochlear implant.
Very similar to a cochlear implant, but it is integrated into the body. There has been some surgical process.
Yeah. I think these discussions are really important, especially when we're talking about technology that is then removed, is removable or removed, daily. If we get to a point where things are implanted, are kind of more stationary, perhaps it's not a concern. I don't know. Are you going to keep it for the rest of your life? I don't know. But when these things are removable, this is a really important discussion. And Paulina and I were kind of, conceptually thinking about, is there this kind of point of no return and saying, but how do we do the research to find that?
If you believe someone like Amber Case, who says we're all cyborgs now, then the very virtue of having a mobile phone, that becomes like an external organ for some people. And I wonder if there has been any studies looking at ripping people's shiny glowing rectangles away from them and finding out if they feel like they've lost an organ. I mean, people describe the phantom vibration sensation of getting a text message when they leave their phone at home. I mean, that's a very subjective sensation, although it's been described similar to taking heroin away from people. It's the same sensations that...
I wonder whether people would actually agree to that study, whether you would be able to find volunteers that say, okay, take my phone away from me.
Wow, it's unethical.
I've seen, I've definitely, I don't know if it was a full study, but some like a kind of proper like with an interviewer and they tested the anxiety levels of someone. So they put their phone behind them and then called them and texted them. So they just started hearing the vibration of their phone or their ringtone behind them, and they were measuring their anxiety, I guess, through their heart rate and kind of sweat glands and stuff like that. And they got their anxiety just continued to skyrocket as the more and more they were not able to check their phone. So I think there is definitely studies that are going
out it definitely feels like that these are... all of these tools and all of these devices are heavily integrated with our body. But again, as you point out in the study, there has to be a differentiation between something which is an augmentative device and a tool. The way in which the control group for the study was individuals who had third thumbs that they weren't able to move. And to them, it was really just this inconvenient addition, this tool, this piece of technology strapped to their hand. The movement and the sensation and the feeling like the human had control was the important thing. So perhaps, in many ways, because the phone is such a dead device, because there's no direct feedback with the body other than that vibration when you get notifications, then maybe we're talking about two completely different things here. This functions more as a tool rather than an assistive device.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very hard distinction to make, especially nowadays. Like, where does the tool end and augmentative device begin, right? And this is one of the ways to look at it. And personally, I think I'm 100% on board to say that, if there is some sort of feedback loop, if I'm controlling it and getting something back from it, it's more on the side of augmentation. And that's not something that's happening with my phone. But perhaps even importantly, in the context of the work that we do in the lab, we define tools as these things that you use to get around to do things better, faster, reach, at a larger distance. But that it's really just something you hold in your hand. You find, like a grasp that you like, that fits the device, that, fits your preferences, and you hold it and, write with a pen or hammer something down. But you don't really do anything weird with your hand. You don't really change the way you use your body in order to operate that tool. You just hold it most of the time. And with augmentative devices such as third thumb, if you actually want to use them and benefit from using them, you have to completely change the way you use your hand. Because if you just go on and, do everything as normal, then you're not using the third thumb at all. And if you try to do everything as normal and somehow incorporate the third thumb, perhaps it would not work. Because what you really need to do is find new finger movement patterns that would cooperate with this extra device. And it's this this change in how we operate our body that I think also for me somehow creates this boundary between a tool and augmentation. And augmentation invites me to use my body in a different way. A tool just allows me to do what I do every day without having to really upgrade or rethink how I do that.
And those distinctions are highly important when we think about the cyborg and we think about cybernetics, because the key, and it always has been in cybernetics, is the feedback loop. You know, the thing that creates a relationship with body, technology, and then back again, which begins to open up some really interesting, I guess, ethical, philosophical, perhaps even legal questions. Because if Dani, you were wearing your device for maybe a year, and I came up to you and for whatever reason I deliberately damaged the third thumb, well, would we consider that grievous bodily harm? Or at that stage, after having worn it for a year, would that be still damage to property? I mean, there's so many weird sort of questions that we're going to have to confront.
That's a really interesting point. I've never really thought about it like that. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a societal and structural kind of legal change rather than, how I felt. Because I would, after wearing it for a year every day, I'm sure I would feel like it was kind of definitely part of me also, but just the fact that someone would do that would really hurt me. But that's such a fascinating question.
Well, say for example, you were out at a bar and someone decided to just do that or vandalize the thumb. So, I mean, these are the questions we're asking of prosthetic limb users today. Because, for example, if someone's a congenital limb defect patient, i.e. they were born without a limb and they have a prosthetic, that's suddenly seen as a device which they're wearing, whereas an amputee is someone who lost an arm, has a prosthetic limb, that's now seen as something that's restoring a functionality they've lost, as opposed to, giving a functionality that they never had. So those two things are fundamentally different. Then there's the question of how it's integrated. I mean, in many ways, the third thumb is a wearable. It's not surgically embedded into the hand yet. Maybe when you mentioned surgeon earlier, I thought you meant they wanted to do that. I didn't realize you meant.
No, sorry. No, surgeon wants to use.
It took me a while. It took me a while to realize. To do surgery.
To do surgery. Yes.
Yeah. A hand surgeon who wanted to surgically implant the third limb is how I first heard that. But no, it makes sense now that it allows them to hold an extra scalpel.
Probably there are surgeons like that out there too.
Yeah. And there might be someone who's willing to do that. And if it was, and in the same way, prosthetic limbs, if they're osseointegrated into the body, where basically they're hammered into the bone, that's seen as a deeper connection between the technology and the body than, say, just wearing a prosthetic limb with a traditional socket. So it feels like there's all these boundary conditions that a study like yours starts to open us up to. And I guess my question is, what are some of the most fascinating future-looking questions that your work is provoking and that you would love to explore?
Firstly, can I just jump back to, congenital one-handers and amputees? I think as a society, obviously we see someone with one arm, and we make, certain people make assumptions, and, having, spoken with a lot of people from both groups, such different like experiences. And we so often group them in one as a person with one arm. And it's just so wrong to do that, because their experiences are so vastly different. And I've spoken to high-level users of prosthetics that are both congenital and amputees and having very similar relationships with their prosthetics. And so I think that you can't kind of assume just because someone has suffered a loss that they perhaps or perhaps have a phantom, that they would perhaps be more connected with their prosthetic, because it's very different. But then vastly on the other end of the spectrum is congenitals who refuse to wear a prosthetic because they were born their whole self, and actually it's quite disabling, because if you can think of the end of their arm as like our hand, so if you were then to add another arm onto your end of your hand, that's kind of how it feels like, or covering the socket covering their kind of functional part, which is their inner elbow. And so these groups are really, different. And then also, with amputees as well, a guy actually contacted me. It was one of the best emails I think I've got out of this whole process is him kind of going, it was amazing to see your third thumb. If someone's finally talking about this, and he goes, I've had an amputation when I was young, and I've been given multiple prostheses across my life, and I've always felt like it's my third arm because it's his third arm that he's had, and so often we think, oh, it's this easy kind of fix. It's this, the phantom just slots right into the prosthetic arm. It absolutely does not. Everyone's phantoms is so different. I spoke to a girl in the lab, and her phantom is kind of up against her body and very tight. And then her, prosthetic then comes out of her off her residual limb. So it's just so technically she kind of has this kind of dual arm kind of sensation. And so I think that, it's such a complex relationship and experience is so personal. Even just, we discussed in the lab a lot about, descriptive words for writing, papers about, individuals, and even the individuals themselves and within their kind of specific groups. I do not agree with how they like to be referred to. And so it's kind of like this ongoing discussion that needs to happen around even the word prosthetic versus augmentation. For a lot of prosthetic users, in quotes, would see their prosthetic as an augmentation. So it's just, I think that we just need to come up with some new words because there's not enough words and just kind of, and really just, work on the individual and their experience about this technology as opposed to kind of just wanting to, we just love putting things in boxes, don't we? So love to kind of group people together. But I think that's why it's fascinating for me is, it's just, we're just at the beginning of this really exciting, work into working with the body and extending the human form. Why do we have to talk about replacement or fixing or, disability or something? It's just, we're extending both augmentation and prosthetic in the current terms we're, defining them as, are extending the human body.
These words we use to talk about prosthetics, which are replace, are actually quite restrictive, right? Because that implies that we want to mimic this body part we lost quite ideally, as much as possible, and we cannot. It's just impossible. I feel like, to a certain extent, our brain is always gonna know this is not your hand, this is not your leg. And, we see these prosthetic devices, especially for lower limb amputees, that actually allow them to do more, like run faster, for example, than, a normal person.
Lower and upper they're very different fields as well.
Yeah. So is that still replacement? Is that still regaining the lost function? Or is that already, enhancing and augmenting? I think like this boundary is very fluid. And, this is also one of the things that come out of this study. We don't really need to fixate so much on this idea of this needs to work and look exactly like my body part. If it doesn't, most likely your brain can still deal with it. And perhaps it even would be better. Like with amputees, they very often reject their prostheses, as Dani said. And surprisingly, the ones that get rejected the least are the ones that are nothing like the hands, both in terms of functions and looks. The hooks, the prostheses that are controlled with the movement of your shoulder.
Yeah, that's proportional control. It's manual proportional control from your shoulder. So there's something there that, the myoelectric has that disconnect with the control that the hooks don't have. Yeah.
I was good friends with the late Nigel Ackland, who always used to talk about this stuff with his tongue thermally in his cheek. And we did a lot of events around this thing called prosthetic envy. He was we used to call him the pioneering pilot of the most advanced prosthetic limb, which was at the time the B-Bionic 3, and people would used to go up to him and they'd look at him with this beautifully designed robotic prosthetic limb and look at it with desire, with envy, going, oh my God, I want one. And he used to respond, well, it's the most exclusive club in the world and it's going to cost you an arm or a leg to get in.
That's a fair response.
And then he would give them the realities of the limb, because even though he'd be put on a pedestal and be shown to be a vision for the future of humanity, the reality was the interface between the skin and the prosthetic limb was very tender. He was an amputee, so he had sharp bone and very new flesh, very new skin. So having something suction cupped onto your body for a long duration of time, every time he sweated, it would become uncomfortable. He couldn't wait to get the thing off at the end of the day. Yes, he would show up for the TED Talks and the Wired Science Talks and show the thing off, but the reality on the ground didn't match the fiction within people's heads when they would look at a prosthetic limb user like him and think, oh wow, I can't wait to cut off my arms so I can get a new robotic prosthetic. And we have to be careful with those imaginings of what these things actually are.
I spoke to during my dissertation, I spoke to a prosthetist in London, and he said that one of the biggest challenges is managing people's expectations. Managing people's expectations, and unfortunately, there is so much kind of tech hype around, because obviously the connection with robots and the future, and especially those in lab videos of this kind of high level use that we're not seeing out of the lab. I want to see it in a field. I want to see it in your home. I want to see it, in a real life scenario, so that people can manage their expectations of this technology, because we're not designing in bone and flesh and blood yet. There is, still limitations. So people kind of, suffering a loss and going, oh, don't worry, I'm going to be fine. They will be, but it'll take time. And it's, there is a kind of big drop off point with these high level prosthetics, because the cognitive load is crazy high. They have to train almost every day. We spoke to one of the high level users of a kind of Be Bionic like one, which is the iLim, and she has to train every day to use it, sit still. So it takes a lot of effort, and I think people underestimate it a little bit and expect that it's just kind of going to be a lot simpler. So I'm hoping this technology keeps developing to make it easier for these users.
Yeah, because on all these flashy videos and advertisement, it just looks like plug and play, but it is plug and train.
Plug and train. And Dani, you certainly know a thing or two about creating flashy videos, and I just wonder, what are some of the responses? Do people email you begging for an extra thumb? Do you get constant inbound going, absolutely. When will it be available? When can I buy one? Will it come with a Bluetooth speaker? I mean, what is the
how much does it cost?
Yeah, how much does it cost? What are some of the crazy emails that you get, Dani?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm a team of one in terms of creating them at the moment, and so I'm definitely interested in pursuing it further. But obviously, the research is my main focus at the moment. But I think definitely emails every day asking for people to buy it. So there's definitely interest. I just want to make sure it's the best it can be before putting it out into the market, and also being sure that I'm not going to mess with people's brains too much.
Well, I'd be remiss in a discussion on augmentation not to ask you both, what sort of augmentations, apart from a third thumb, what sort of augmentations would you personally want? And it can be as crazy as you choose.
I think, for me, I explored during my master's as well, just sensory extension as well, which is something that I created an interest in and then didn't pursue, because obviously pursued this kind of more of a motor augmentation. But I really am fascinated with whiskers. I don't know why. Whiskers, like this kind of extension. And I created a little prototype of, having this kind of whisker on my hand. So something like that. But in terms of kind of motor function, I think that, something, off the back. But I mean, obviously I want a hand or something like that, but it'll be kind of I think a three finger that can kind of rotate around, and then just kind of exploring different spots on the arm as well. I think it'd be really interesting in terms of the control to kind of perhaps have a collaborative control, perhaps inspired by the didnt surgical system, and in that they kind of smooth the kind of human movements through that kind of control, and so perhaps something a bit more smoothed in terms of helping me with soldering and assembly.
And Paulina, what would you desire?
Yeah, I have two that I would, perhaps not want to have all the time, but as sort of wearables, or maybe one of them all the time. One thing is, in terms of sensory augmentation, just being able to see more colors, like the whole wave spectrum.
Oh, that's a good one.
You read about dogs and bats and different animals seeing all these shades of colors that I cannot even imagine. We read that they see that many colors, and I just cannot begin to grasp it, right? Because to me, the color spectrum is finished. So I'd like to see them.
They've designed a camera now. I think I watched a documentary recently about and they've designed a camera that can see in infrared colors and ultraviolet colors. So surely it's not that far away to then kind of convert that kind of camera input into something that we can understand.
Yeah. So that's one. And the second one is on the motor side, and that's definitely something to be taken on and off. I'd like to have wings. I mean, who doesn't want to fly every now and then?
Cool. There's always one.
There's always one.
And, just to fly to my friend's house, have a drink, fly back home. What kind of wings?
Would you Would you do a biomimicry butterfly, bird?
No,
or bat?
No.
A
I would
bat,
go
for sure.
Full
bat.
Crazy, like dragon wings. That's not even biomimicry, right?
Paulina, dragons aren't real. Sorry to burst your bubble.
Yeah, someone has clearly been watching too much Game of Thrones. Well, I can't wait to see both of you at Comic-Con very soon, and Dani with her furry whiskers, and Paulina with her dragon wings. And on that provocative note about what the future of the human might potentially look like, please sign me up for the next study. I'm quite happy to be a user of a third thumb, and I want to thank you both for taking the time for being on the Futures podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It's been lots of fun.
Thank you to Dani and Paulina for showing us the ways in which the human body can be used as a platform for a multitude of augmentation devices. You can find out more by downloading their latest paper in the Science Robotics Journal. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.